Good morning and welcome. We are continuing our daily video devotions through the book of 1 Samuel with 1 Samuel chapter 13 this morning. And for our last few devotions, we've been talking about this man named Saul, who was the first king over Israel. And here in 1 Samuel 13, Saul gets one of his first challenges as king. And this challenge is that the Philistine army, and the Philistines were this nation that surrounded Israel, this very powerful nation even, decide to threaten Israel. And in the first part of chapter 13, the Israelites, led by Jonathan, who was Saul's son, have this surprising victory over the Philistines. And the surprising victory was great, no doubt, but one of the downsides of the surprising victory is that the Philistines decide to take Israel much more seriously than perhaps they had before. So in the latter half of chapter 13, we hear about how many chariots and how many cavalry men, I guess I don't know that they would refer to them as cavalry, but men on horseback and different warriors the Philistines had compared to the Israelites. The Israelites were just far, far outnumbered by the Philistines. And Saul gets nervous, the Israelite army gets nervous because they see how outnumbered and how outmanned they are. And they decide that they need to make this sacrifice to God to entreat God to back them up as they prepared for this battle against the Philistines. And the problem, though, is that Samuel is still the prophet of the Lord in these days, and they really need Samuel to come to make this sacrifice, this offering to God. Well, Saul waits for 7 days for Samuel to come, and yet he still hasn't arrived. And Saul's nervous. Saul sees how nervous some of his men are. In fact, he sees how some of his men are just beginning to leave because they don't think Samuel's ever coming, and they don't want to stick around to be massacred by the Philistines. So Saul grows impatient, and instead of waiting on Samuel to make this offering, which is what he really needed to do, Saul decides to make it himself. Well, sure enough, not very long after Saul makes the offering, Samuel does arrive, and Samuel lets Saul know what a big mistake that was for Saul to grow impatient, for Saul to lose his trust in Samuel, but also his trust in the Lord. And the rest of 1 Samuel is really a story about how this decision that Saul made, this impatience that he had, will actually be the beginning of the end of his role, or his time as king over Israel. And see, this text got me thinking this morning and the last few days as I've read and thought about it, is how often in our life do we face adversity? Do we face uncertainty? Do we face a great challenge, a challenge that we don't know whether we can make it through on our own or not? And because things don't always go according to our own timing, to our own desires, we lose patience with God. We begin to doubt God's faithfulness. We forget about the trust that we should have in God. And see, I think this story is a good reminder that even in uncertain circumstances, even when we face adversity or when we face a great challenge or great difficulty in our life, we need to persevere in our faith. We need to continue to trust in God, and trust in God even more than we would in good times, because we know that God is good and faithful to us, and we know that even in the midst of a challenge, God is with us. God is at work in our lives, creating a way for us to make it through the challenge that's before us. So think about that over the next few days, and we'll see you on Friday for 1 Samuel chapter 14.